A burning harbor, 3 Portuguese vessels, hulls blackened, sails torn. The men aboard were not celebrating, they were counting their dead. And somewhere on the shore, a Filipino datu watched them leave. This is not a story most history textbooks tell you. Colonial archives buried it under diplomatic language and cartographic erasure. But the events of the early 16th century in the waters around Maluku, Mindanao, and the broader archipelago speak clearly, if you read them against the grain of Portuguese imperial correspondence. The Portuguese did not conquer the Philippines. They tried, and they failed. And then they called that failure a treaty. To understand why, you need to go back to the decade before Ferdinand Magellan ever set foot on the Homenon Island. Back to 1511 when Portugal seized Malacca. That was the moment Lisbon believed the entire maritime world of Southeast Asia would open like a door. Portuguese Viceroy Afonso de Albuquerque wrote to his king with the confidence of a man who had never met a Visayan fleet in open water. He had not yet, but there's a detail. The sultanates and chiefdoms that stretched from Borneo through the Sulu Sea to the Visayas were not scattered villages. They were networked polities bound by trade, kinship, and a shared understanding of maritime warfare that the Portuguese chroniclers consistently misread as piracy. Raiding and counter-raiding between rival lords followed elaborate protocols. A datu who could field 500 warriors in outrigger caracoas was not leading a mob. He was commanding a mobile strike force, low in the water, fast beyond Portuguese reckoning, and crewed by men who had trained on these channels since childhood. Portugal brought cannons. The Datis brought knowledge of the tides. Important. The first serious Portuguese probing of the Philippine waters came through their expeditions radiating outward from the Spice Islands. They needed the archipelago as a waypoint and as a source of gold. Mindanao had gold. Visayan ports had provisions. The Portuguese assumed that the same template that worked in Goa and on the Swahili coast would work here. Arrive, demonstrate firepower, extract tribute or trade on coercive terms. On the other hand, the assumption collapsed fast. Datu Lapu-Lapu is the name Filipino school children learn first, and the death of Magellan at Mactan in April 1521 is rightly famous, truly famous. But that battle was a symptom of a deeper problem the Portuguese and Spanish alike struggled to name. The problem was structural to the archipelago itself. There was no single capital to capture. There was no single king to depose or cow into submission. Every island chain had its own hierarchy of datus. Defeating one did not move the needle on another. Lisbon's entire strategic playbook depended on decapitating a political structure. The Philippine archipelago refused to have a single head. To be honest, after Mactan, the survivors of Magellan's expedition fled. They carried with them a message that took years to fully absorb in Lisbon and Seville. The people of these islands would fight, and they were good at it. Portuguese captains who wrote back to Lisbon in the 1520s and 1530s described their encounters in terms that reveal their frustration without quite admitting defeat. A fleet from Ternate, operating in coordination with Portuguese interests, tried to establish a firmer presence in the southern Philippine waters around this. The local lords along the Sulu archipelago did not retreat. They negotiated from strength and raided when negotiations stalled. The Sulu lords had trading relationships extending to China, to Java, to the Malay ports. Really ports. They did not need Portuguese permission to exist in the maritime economy. The Portuguese needed their cooperation far more than the reverse. This asymmetry was the engine of everything that followed. By the 1530s, the pattern had clarified. Portuguese vessels operating near Mindanao faced sustained resistance from confederacies of datis who shared tactical intelligence across island networks faster than any colonial dispatch rider could travel. A Portuguese captain who overstepped in one bay would find the next bay already alerted. Ambushes in narrow straits, raiding parties that hit Portuguese-aligned trading posts and vanished before any punitive expedition could form. The Caracoa fleets were not large Portuguese carracks. They were not meant to be. 30 feet long, powered by oars, able to beach on any sandbar. A Portuguese man of war could not follow them into the shallows. One generation after Magellan died on that beach at Mactan, the Portuguese had not secured a single permanent foothold in the Philippine archipelago. Truly archipelago, not one, The documents that survived from this in the Portuguese archives in Lisbon use a careful vocabulary. Words like pacification efforts and trade agreements appear in dispatches that, read alongside indigenous oral histories and the accounts of other European observers, describe something closer to an enforced stalemate. The Portuguese crown authorized several expeditions aimed at securing the archipelago's gold routes and establishing fortified trading posts. These expeditions encountered resistance that the chroniclers attributed to treachery or barbarity, the standard colonial vocabulary for losing a fight you expected to win. Interesting fact, the Datas who coordinated this resistance left no written archives in the European sense. Their records existed in oral tradition, in the memory of their descendants, in the barangay structures that survived Spanish colonization, by adapting rather than collapsing. The absence of a Filipino-authored written record from this is itself a product of the colonial archive's survival. You cannot find what was never meant for you to find in a Lisbon filing cabinet. But the absence of Portuguese success is itself evidence. By the 1540s, the shape of the situation had become clear enough that Portuguese strategy shifted. Formal military conquest of the Philippine archipelago was quietly abandoned as an active objective. What replaced it was a policy of selective engagement. Trade where trade was possible, avoid confrontation where it was costly, and manage relationships with individual Datu networks rather than attempting to impose a colonial hierarchy over the whole system. In the language of the court in Lisbon, this became peaceful relations and mutual agreements. In the language of what happened, the Datas had made the cost of conquest prohibitive. This is where the ceasefire that was never called a ceasefire enters the story. Portuguese and Filipino lords formalized certain trading relationships in the mid-16th century in ways that required the Portuguese to acknowledge local authority rather than subordinate it. A Portuguese captain dealing with a Sulu or Visayan Datu in this was not dictating terms. He was negotiating them. The Datu controlled the anchorage. The Datu controlled the provisions. The Datu controlled whether that captain's ship left the harbor or stayed there. The documents Lisbon filed as trade agreements were, in their operational reality, recognitions of Filipino sovereignty over Filipino waters. The Spanish who arrived in force in 1565 under Miguel López de Legazpi brought a different approach and an alliance with certain Filipino factions against others. They succeeded where Portugal had failed, partly through that strategy of internal alliance, and partly because they brought a colonizing population, not a trading fleet. Even then, the Sulu Sultanate and the highland polities of Luzon and Mindanao resisted Spanish authority for centuries. The Spanish never fully conquered the south. They built a wall in Manila and called it an empire. Wait a second. The Portuguese experience in the decade before Spain arrived deserves to be read as what it was: a military and political defeat absorbed into the language of commerce. All right. The Datas who held those straits and harbors did not do so by accident. They maintained confederacies through marriage alliances, through shared economic interest, and through a military culture that the Portuguese kept underestimating. The Caracoa fleet tactics described in fragmentary accounts suggest a coordinated naval doctrine: harassment, encirclement in shallows, concentration of fire from multiple small vessels against a single large target. A Portuguese carrack was formidable on open water. In the channels of the Visayas, it was slow, deep-drafted, and surrounded. This is not a story about a primitive people getting lucky against technologically superior invaders. The Datas who managed this resistance were sophisticated political operators. They read Portuguese intentions accurately. They adjusted their alliances as circumstances changed. They understood that the Portuguese needed the trade routes more than any single island group did, and they used that leverage. On the other hand, the gold of Mindanao did not flow to Lisbon on Portuguese terms. It continued to flow through networks that Filipino lords controlled, toward China and the Malay world, on timetables and at prices set by people whose names the Portuguese scribes rarely bothered to record correctly, if at all. And that is precisely what the historical record's silence hides. Somewhere in the gap between the Portuguese phrase, "we established peaceful commerce," and the Filipino reality of "we set the terms of every transaction," the actual history of this lives. Oral traditions preserved in communities across the Visayas and Mindanao carry fragments of these encounters. Epics like the Darangen of the Maranao people hold within their verses a memory of conflict and negotiation with foreign fleets that no European document fully captures. Researchers have only begun to read these sources alongside colonial archives in the past few decades. Well, there's a catch. The picture that emerges from that reading is not comfortable for anyone raised on the standard colonial narrative. The Philippine archipelago in the early 16th century was not a passive territory waiting to be claimed. It was a contested maritime space controlled by experienced lords who had been managing complex inter-island politics for generations before any European ship appeared on their horizon. Portugal reached for it. The reach failed, and the failure got filed under a different name. Decades from now, as Filipino scholars gain broader institutional resources, and as digital archives make cross-referencing colonial documents with indigenous sources faster and more thorough, the scale of what the Portuguese encountered here will become harder to minimize. The oral histories that survive Spanish colonization carry specific memories, while genealogies of data families record alliances and victories that no Lisbon dispatch preserves. Maritime archaeology in the Sulu Sea continues to surface artifacts that complicate the standard timeline. There are accounts still locked in European ecclesiastical archives that no Filipino researcher has yet been funded adequately to examine. The Vatican holds mission records from early Jesuit contact with communities that predate full Spanish consolidation. Portuguese